Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. Uganda's parliament recently passed some of the most sweeping anti-LGBTQ plus legislation in the world. Same-sex acts were already unlawful in Uganda, but lawmakers have voted to altogether ban both identifying as LGBTQ plus and or so-called promotion of gay identity. This means a sweeping ban not only outlaws consensual same-sex acts, it also criminalizes simply openly identifying as LGBTQ+. To learn more about the impact of these far-reaching laws, we're joined by Frank Mugisha, Executive Director of the recently banned Sexual Minorities Uganda, or SMUG, a prominent lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer rights organization in Kampala. Dr. Frank Mugisha, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much for having me, and greetings from Kampala, Uganda.
What do outsiders get right or wrong about the impact of anti-LGBTQ plus laws in Uganda?
Yes, the bill received a lot of support, and what we saw in our parliament on that day is a reflection of the Ugandans. Majority of Ugandans support anti-gay laws. Majority of Ugandans support extreme anti-gay laws and criminalization of homosexuality. What is commonly not understood is how much impact this legislation have on the lives of LGBTQ persons in the country. People like myself and my other colleagues who live here. What we are seeing is the crackdown on LGBTQ persons. We are seeing violence. We are seeing arrests. We are seeing increase in social exclusion. LGBTQ persons are getting denied services. LGBTQ persons are getting expelled from schools. They are losing employment. We are seeing violence as LGBTQ persons are going on with their own ordinary lives. So the hate speech rather from parliament and from political leaders and from extreme religious groups creates a lot of violence towards the LGBTQ community. And we're seeing an increase in violence towards the community.
Before being banned, Sexual Minorities Uganda, the organization that you spearhead, had provided education on sexuality and advocated for health services for LGBTQ plus people since 2004. How are people receiving care right
Right now, how our communities receive care, our communities are directed or provided with referrals to some of the health facilities where we have trained and educated some doctors and health practitioners to receive and support and provide services to LGBTQ persons without prejudice. So we directed them to these places. But now it is becoming seemingly very, very difficult for some of our allies and partners to provide services to the LGBTQ community. One, because the community is shying away. They are scared of being discriminated. They are scared of getting arrested if they come out openly to the doctors. And some of the partners who support us are also afraid of providing services because they will be labeled as promoters of homosexuality.
now? One of the interesting things about this new body of legislation is that same-sex acts have been criminal in Uganda under British colonial era laws, but this new legislation actually goes further, if my understanding is correct. The so-called aggravated. I wanted to know if you sort of could talk a little bit more about the so-called aggravated homosexuality, which includes sex with someone who has HIV, or even with a minor. Can you talk a little bit about what this piece of the legislation means?
Thank you. So, in the legislation, aggravated homosexuality means any sexual conduct between an LGBTQ person and another LGBTQ person. If one of them has HIV and AIDS, then that would be aggravated homosexuality. Also, it criminalizes pedophiles. If anyone is abusing children in same sex, this would criminalize them. And also, aggravated homosexuality would criminalize someone if they engage in sexual acts, if they are in authority. Meaning, if you employ someone or if someone works for you and you engage into same-sex acts with them, you'd be executed, because aggravated homosexuality has a death penalty. But let us not confuse this aggravated homosexuality to be convicting sexual abuse or abuse of children. It is also looking at any person who has broken this law more than once, where it talks about serial offenders. So a serial offender can be anyone. For instance, it criminalizes providing housing to any person who is known as LGBTQ person, meaning a landlord who breaks the law more than once could be a serial offender. Meaning two consenting adults who get convicted more than once under this legislation could be serial offenders and they could be executed under this law. So the law, yes, punishes pedophiles or child sexual abuse to death penalty, but it also goes further to criminalize consenting adults if they are serial offenders. It goes further to criminalize advocates who promote homosexuality, because promotion of homosexuality for any advocates who speak out as seen as promotion of homosexuality is outlawed. So if you break the law more than once, then you become a serial offender and you could be executed.
The legislation, the laws are highly punitive, right? And on the other hand, I wonder if there's any data to support the just the extensiveness of the law. That, is there any data to support pedophilia in the country? Where is this data coming from? What is substantiating this particular body of legislation? And two, maybe we could talk a little bit about how punitive, but sort of the main observation is that this is highly punitive. I've read somewhere that some crimes are punishable by death and imposing up to 20 years in prison for people identifying as LGBTQ plus. One, data. Two, what are your thoughts on these very, very extensive and highly punitive criminal sentences?
Thank you. There is no data at all to support the background that there is abuse or sexual exploitation of minors by the LGBT community or by homosexuals, as Ugandans say. However, the irony is that, on the other hand, there is a lot of data and information. Some of this is accessible to any ordinary Ugandans at the police stations that shows the extreme abuse of young girls under the age of 18 by heterosexual men. A lot of that is published every year in our crime reports here by the police. There is no empirical data at all to show one, recruiting of children, male children into homosexuality, grooming of children is not there. There is no empirical data to show there is abuse of any male child. So this law is entirely based on conspiracy theories that are promoted by American extreme evangelicals who have confused Ugandans and told Ugandans this is a homosexual agenda, out to recruit children into homosexuality, out to groom youngsters into homosexuals. And if you look at the punitive and how extreme this legislation is, this legislation would punish children. This law is saying it's here to protect children, but this law will punish young LGBTQ persons who are under the age of 18. And this is any person who identifies as queer under the age of 18. It will punish them to 3 years in prison. This is so extreme for any child offenses here in Uganda. And secondly, this law we already have laws that punish homosexuality in my country. There was no need to bring another extreme law. This law has a death penalty, has life in prison. It would criminalize any person who provides housing for any LGBTQ person. It would criminalize any person who does not report any person they know who is LGBTQ person. So a friend, a brother, a sister, a parent of an LGBTQ person would become compelled to report them. Doctors, I've said it many times, a Catholic like myself, if I confess to my priest, then my priest would be compelled to report me to the authority. This law it is the most extreme and most draconian piece of legislation that punishes same-sex acts in Africa so far.
Homosexuality is criminalized in more than 30 of Africa's 54 countries. Wide international condemnation across the world in this regard. The White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby has said that Washington, D.C. is watching this very closely. The U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, is also paying close attention to this, in addition to the United Nations and the European bodies. What is your message to the politicians who are pushing an agenda that is largely going to impact the daily life of people? You're in the healthcare space. Tell them a little bit about how people are experiencing the anxieties, sort of just the tensions, just what comes with this type of legislation for your community.
For the LGBT community in Uganda, there's a lot of fear. Many LGBTQ persons are thinking of fleeing the country if this law is signed by the president. And maybe I can remind viewers that tomorrow this law is coming back to our parliament, and it will definitely get voted and will be sent back to the president. So we anticipate that this law could be signed by the president soon. And if the anxiety, the fear, the paranoia, the mental health and trauma that this is causing to the community is extreme. Many people are worried, they are scared, and like I said, people are thinking of fleeing the country, and people are worried about their own jobs. Some people have been told by their bosses that they will get fired because they are known as LGBTQ persons. Some people will not be allowed in certain places if this law is passed because of the fear. Some people will not be provided with services like medical services. So the biggest problem right now is the paranoia, the fear, the mental health, and trauma that this legislation has caused the LGBTQ community, who are thinking, what else? What do they do when this?
And I'm wondering, as a healthcare provider, how do you care for this type of issue? If this is all a taboo, how do you maintain a healthcare practice that addresses the needs of a community that is suffering?
Well, we have a legislation that is saying that you're compelled to report. That means any healthcare provider for the LGBTQ community will have to report to the authorities. And if they don't report, then you become a criminal. And here we have code of ethics that doctors and health practitioners sign to. And that means that they will be breaking that code of ethics where you have to report your own client to the authorities. But putting that aside, the fact that there is a legislation that will make it very difficult for an LGBTQ person to leave their home or where they live and go to seek medical services or to seek support is bad enough that even the demand for the services that are available will not be possible because LGBTQ persons will simply shy away for the fear of getting exposed, for the fear of getting arrested, for the fear of getting discriminated when they're accessing these services.
Can these laws be understood as human rights violations?
These laws is persecution. There's no other word for it. It is gross violation of the human rights of LGBTQ persons. Because this legislation is here to erase the entire identity and the existence of an LGBTQ person. But if the legislation has a death penalty and is also compelling people to report any any person who is known or perceived to be LGBTQ person, but also denying housing for an LGBTQ person. This is early warning signs of genocide. These are gross violations of an LGBTQ person, and this is persecution under the international law.
Now, according to the BBC, between 2017 and 2020, nearly 200 people in Uganda were charged with so called unnatural offensive. Are there other local or are there any local bodies with the authority to step in to offer some protection for people either legally or socially?
Yes, the community has a lot of supporters locally. There are human rights organizations and the legal aid clinics that provide services, some of them free services to the community. We have done some education, some of the lawyers. In fact, before Sexual Minorities Uganda was shut down, we had provided training some law enforcement not to arrest LGBTQ persons on merely being suspected as LGBTQ persons, because the law we have right now only punishes the sexual act, not the individual. So we had provided some training, some law enforcement, and indeed we're seeing some results. But right now, with this legislation, it would not allow any support towards the LGBTQ persons from our partners in civil society, from some of our legal partners, and of course, definitely from some of the law enforcement that we've trained.
Now, you mentioned and alluded to it a little bit earlier. You made a little footnote that the evangelicals might very well be pushing this agenda. I wonder if the anti-trans identity and medical bans that we see playing out across the United States, whether or not these legislative bans in American states are making it easier for other world democracies to pursue these anti-queer policy agendas without even raising an international eyebrow as to what's going on in Uganda and indeed around the world. Can you help us connect the dots? Why did you make that comment?
I made that comment simply because I've said it many times that the homophobia and transphobia we are seeing in Uganda is not Ugandan at all. The language that Ugandans are using right now to hate LGBTQ persons is not language we grew up seeing. All this has been exported here by extreme American evangelicals. Just a few weeks ago, we had American evangelicals here convincing Ugandan politicians that conversion therapy works, that there are many LGBTQ persons, queer and transgender LGBT, queer and transgender persons who have been changed, who have changed back. And so we grew up here not even having a conversation around conversion therapy and rehabilitation of LGBTQ persons. But our politicians right now are speaking about it and they're saying there are efforts from the West that are very supportive and have been supported by data and science that can change an LGBTQ person. So this is being promoted here, and it's being promoted by American extreme evangelicals. So whatever is happening in the global West is being exported here. All the backlash we're seeing around the trans community, all the backlash we're seeing around conversion therapy, rehabilitation of LGBTQ persons, this is the exact language that is being pushed into our legislations. And not only Uganda, but it's being pushed in other parts of Africa, including Ghana, Kenya, and other places.
Talk a little bit about the refugee crisis. You just, again, sort of connected and made a footnote as regarding the fact that there's several over 30 countries across the continent of Africa that have actually sort of promoting these types of bans. Can we talk about the refugee crisis that this also contains as we talk about genocide, as we talk about Western imperial influence? What does this mean for Ugandans who, to save their own lives, may have to flee, where would they go on the continent?
So yes, and I've mentioned many times, it is going to be a big refugee crisis when this legislation is signed into law by the president, but also when this legislation spills over to other countries. And that's why the international community should care, because then Uganda and other African nations are creating a refugee crisis, because many LGBTQ persons are going to flee the country. Those that can afford to be able to get a plane ticket and a visa to go to other international countries will do so. In 2009, when the anti-gay legislation was introduced in Uganda, many of my colleagues fled the country, and now they live abroad. But majority of LGBTQ persons who can't afford to leave the country and go to the West, they will flee to neighboring countries like Kenya, which has a refugee camp where the conditions are not friendly to the LGBT community, but of course for their safety and not to be in prison or to face mob justice, because we know if this law is signed by the president, there will be mob justice towards the LGBT community. There will be communities, Ugandan society, Ugandans themselves will take the law into their hands and harass LGBTQ persons. So many LGBTQ persons are ready, planning to leave and go into the refugee settlement camps in Kenya. But also, we're going to have an issue of internally displaced persons, because we know many LGBTQ persons are going to be disowned by their own families. So they will have to find a place to stay. Those that can't afford to leave the country, either they will be in prison or they will be internally displaced here in Uganda.
It certainly looks like a crisis is coming that way. The Ugandan president has long supported this body of legislation. Legislators, as you mentioned, passed a previous anti homosexuality law in 2014, but the court struck it down on a procedural grounds following outrage in Uganda and really from international donors. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about where Uganda goes from here in terms of human rights.
If this legislation is signed into law, it will definitely give a very bad picture to Uganda in terms of human rights, unfortunately. And we've been advocating for this and saying we do not need this kind of attention from the international community. Uganda should not go this way. We've been advocating this to our members of parliament and our government and telling them you do not need to criminalize two consenting adults with this extreme legislation, because it puts Uganda in a very wrong and bad spotlight. Secondly, it will isolate Uganda on the international scene, not only on international scene, but even on the regional scene. It will limit tourists and investors from within Africa, from abroad. The challenge is that many Ugandans think that there are no queer and transgender persons in Africa. There are many colleagues who are reaching out within the African continent. They are worried of working and investing in Uganda, trading with Uganda, coming to Uganda as tourists, because they are queer persons from South Africa and other parts of Africa. So the isolation will not only be at the international scene, but also in the regional scene. But then the partners who work with us in Uganda will also get isolated. Ugandans who live abroad will get isolated. You know, when you talk about Uganda, when you're traveling abroad, they ask you about Idi Amin and anti-homosexuality. So we don't want to be the country that is seen to be extremely anti-gay. Many Ugandans who live and work abroad are going to get isolated and they're going to be seen as homophobes and transphobes. Unfortunately, some of them are not even homophobic, but because the country is giving them that flag of wherever Uganda is, Uganda will be seen as a homophobic country. Whenever Uganda speaks out, Uganda will be seen as a homophobic country. Whenever Uganda is engaging into anything, it will be seen as a homophobic country. And we've been advocating and telling Ugandans, if you want to protect children, this legislation does not protect children at all. We all agree in principle, children should be protected from any person who is violating them, even if it's a homosexual person or a heterosexual person. The children should be protected. But you cannot say criminalizing consenting adults going to protect children. You're only creating human rights issues for the country Uganda and isolating Uganda at the international and regional scene.
Finally, can we talk a little bit about advocacy and activism? What does or should activism and advocacy look like both inside and outside of Uganda?
For Uganda, it is very important to advocate and speak out in support of LGBTQ human rights using the Ugandan context, reminding Ugandans and telling Ugandans that LGBTQ persons have lived here for a very long time. They have been within communities. And before the extreme American evangelicals came to Uganda and started introducing language that is criminalizing LGBTQ persons were never criminalized. Yes, there could have been names, and maybe some Ugandans frowned upon LGBTQ persons, but no one was saying LGBTQ persons should be killed, should be arrested, should be isolated. No one was saying that. And in all our languages and tribes and traditions, LGBTQ persons are recognized. There are names that refer to LGBTQ persons, and there are names that refer to queer and trans persons in our own societies. So reminding Ugandans of that and asking Ugandans important questions. One, if you're saying that LGBTQ persons undermine population growth, look at our population. It has been growing rapidly. They are saying there are many homosexuals now. If you're saying that LGBTQ persons increase the spread of HIV and AIDS, many of us in Uganda know that Uganda is one of the countries that has been very good in fighting HIV and AIDS, and it has never been seen as a homosexual disease. Here in Uganda, that would not work, would not resonate with anyone. Every person who is an adult will know a relative or a family member who either died of HIV and AIDS or was affected by HIV and AIDS. If you're saying homosexuality affects religion, religion has been growing rapidly in Uganda, and there are many LGBTQ persons who are religious. So if you're saying LGBTQ persons recruit and groom children, you don't have any data or any information to show you that. So we tell Ugandans this legislation is totally based on conspiracy theories. And for the international community, the importance is that to show that homophobia and transphobia is not only an African problem. Homophobia and transphobia, we are seeing backlash in the United States. The United States has had, I'm told, more than 200 anti-gay legislation in just 1 year. So I show that the backlash we're seeing as the queer and transgender community is global. And I think it's about time we address it as a global problem. The international community should not shy away to speaking out and raising concern about the human rights, the safety issues. Right now, it's the safety issues of LGBTQ persons around the world. And the fact that if this legislation is not stopped in Uganda, it's going to spill over other countries, creating a refugee crisis, putting LGBTQ persons at risk, putting diplomats, interagencies, and global queer persons who work in Africa at risk. So it's not only a problem for queer Ugandans, it's a problem for employees of the American embassy who are working here, employees of interagencies who are working here, employees of multinational corporations who are working here, who are queer, who will definitely be affected by this legislation.
Dr. Frank Mugisha, Executive Director of the recently banned Sexual Minorities Uganda, SMUG, a prominent lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer rights organization in Kampala, Uganda. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and to share this incredible story we'll be following.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.